It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello. In the immortal words of Mike Pompeo, I'll just be sitting here listening.
Okay, very good. You can jump in every once in a while. Don't stonewall us.
I'm just listening in on the conversation just to make sure.
Okay. And of course, we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Well, we have a very exciting show today. An epic battle is shaping up between Congress and the White House over the impeachment of Donald Trump. How this constitutional crisis turns out could determine whether the Congress and the executive are, in reality, co-equal branches of government. Events are unfolding swiftly. But as of this recording, the House Intelligence Committee has subpoenaed all of the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani's relevant documents. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is admitted to being on the phone call, as David was referring to, the phone call that took place in July between Donald Trump and the president of Ukraine, but is hinting that he may not cooperate or let other State Department officials cooperate with the committee, terming it as bullying. The head of the Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, has stated that any attempts on the part of the White House to stonewall would be considered obstruction and included in any articles of impeachment. And Donald Trump insists he has the right to confront the whistleblower who first reported the phone call. And the President of the United States is throwing around words like spy and treason and calling the impeachment inquiry itself a coup. Meanwhile, public opinion polls are inching favorably toward the idea of impeachment. That's where we are at this moment. So first up on the program, we are going to be talking to John Bonifaz, a public interest litigator who's been calling for the impeachment of Donald Trump for a long time now. He's written extensively on the subject and even made an impeachment case for George W. Bush in light of the illegal war in Iraq. So we'll do a deep dive into all of that with Mr. Bonifaz. Also on the show, we're going to talk about the recent climate strike march that took place on the 20th of September. I went to the climate strike here in Los Angeles. It was quite inspiring. More young people than I have seen at any demonstration recently. Estimates put the worldwide numbers at around 4 million marchers. So to give us his take on all of that is the green cowboy himself, our old friend and frequent guest, David Freeman. Regular listeners know that David Freeman is not only a progressive advocate on energy issues, he knows of which he speaks because he has actually run utilities, both in Sacramento, California, and a little project you may have heard of called the Tennessee Valley Authority. So we're looking forward to hearing what David has to say about that. As always, in between, we will take a short break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, because it seems like there's never any shortage of crime in the corporate boardrooms. But first, let's hear what our first guest thinks of the case for the impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. David?
John Bonifaz is a public interest lawyer and the co-founder and president of Free Speech for People, which was founded to overturn the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. Mr. Bonifaz previously served as the executive director and then general counsel of the National Voting Rights Institute and has been at the forefront of key voting rights battles in the country for more than 2 decades. In 2004, Mr. Bonifaz wrote the book Warrior King, The Case for Impeaching George W. Bush. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, John Bonifaz.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome indeed, John. Let's start with this. I just heard an interview of a Trump supporter in an upstate New York congressional district, and this was on public radio. And he kept saying, "Where's the crime? Where's the crime?" in relation to the conversation with the President of Ukraine and President Trump. Why don't you explain to people who keep asking that, and we'll show them some crimes in a few moments that Trump has committed again and again under the rubric of constitutional offenses. How would you answer that, man? Where is the crime in the context of impeachment?
Well, it's really incredible when you hear some of the people trying to defend Donald Trump, what kind of alternate universe they live in. The fact is what happened on July 25th when President Trump called President Zelensky of Ukraine is he directly solicited from the Ukrainian president assistance for his reelection campaign, foreign assistance in his reelection campaign, which in and of itself is a violation of federal campaign finance law. He also used extortion and bribery to try to get that assistance. But the real question here when it comes to impeachment is not about whether there's been a crime under federal criminal law, and there are crimes the president has committed under federal criminal law. The real question is whether he has committed crimes against the state. That's what high crimes refers to: abuse of power, abuse of the public trust. And this president has been repeatedly committing abuses of power and abuses of the public trust since he took the oath of office.
Well, the framers of our Constitution made it very clear, did it not, John, that high crimes and misdemeanors do not have to be statutory crimes. But let's go down to the table where this man was asking the question, where is the crime? Well, first of all, he violated the campaign finance laws. You cannot ask a foreign leader to help you against a domestic political opponent in an upcoming campaign. That is crime number one. Crime number two is he's also engaging in dragnet surveillance, and without a judicial warrant, that is a violation of the FISA Act, which carries a 5-year jail term, is a first-class felony, i.e., he's committing crimes regularly, daily, under his regime. Number three, he's violating one of James Madison's greatest triumphs, which is to put the spending power exclusively in Congress. And Trump has cavalierly and regularly, whether it's not spending money for the national parks or whether it's diverting $3.6 billion from the Pentagon budget appropriated by Congress to build this infamous wall and other similar things like moving to suspend in mid-year foreign aid, which is appropriated by Congress, that is a crime under the federal anti-deficiency statute. And that's not just a constitutional impeachable offense. That is a crime. And of course, his intimidation of the whistleblower under the Whistleblower Act, that's a federal crime. And he's made it clear that he's going after this whistleblower, intimating that in the old days, such people were traitors and were executed. So let's get rid of this notion that Trump has not committed crimes. And of course, that doesn't even touch the emoluments clause, right? Why don't you explain that in detail?
Yes, I agree fully with that list. I would just add two more before getting into the emoluments clauses. We obviously know, based on the Mueller report, that he was engaged in 10 separate incidents of obstruction of justice, all of which are crimes. And then we also know he was named Individual 1 by the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office for directing a criminal conspiracy to violate federal campaign finance laws for those secret hush money payments prior to the 2016 election, for which his then private attorney, Michael Cohen, is now sitting in jail for having committed that crime. So there are many crimes. You're absolutely right that this president's committed under federal statutes, but it's also true that he's committed constitutional violations, and the foreign and domestic emoluments clause violations were the very first that he committed. This president, before he took the oath of office, refused to divest fully from his business interests all over the world, setting himself on a collision course with the two anti-corruption provisions of the Constitution. The foreign emoluments clause makes clear that no official, no elected official shall receive any foreign payments or foreign benefits from any foreign government. And yet this president, with all of his business interests around the world, repeatedly has been receiving, since his time in office, illegal foreign payments and foreign benefits. In addition, the domestic emoluments clause applies only to the president and makes clear that the president shall not receive any benefits from the federal government or any state government other than the federal salary for the office of the president. And again, we have Trump, having not divested from his business interests, operating businesses in the United States with the Trump International Hotel right there in Washington, D.C., receiving all those illegal benefits. So this is a president who has had disregard for the Constitution from the moment he took that oath of office.
And John, he brags about it. Unlike Nixon, who slinked into a corner, he brags about it. He boasts about it. He even allowed the Pentagon to spend $500,000 taxpayer dollars for their personnel to stay at his Scottish hotel, which was a long distance from where they were doing their business. So he actually has written the articles of impeachment, bragged about it day after day, but he's oblivious to any distinction between right and wrong. He keeps saying, I've done nothing wrong. I've done nothing wrong. He's never admitted one mistake of violating laws yet. So let's explain this obstruction of justice, because people keep talking about that without completing the paragraph. When you are obstructing justice, like the 10 times in the Mueller report, and Mueller report was like a patsy. So when he says, 10 obstruction of justice, that's pretty serious. Spell out what obstruction of justice means and how it destroys any concept of the rule of law enforcement.
Yes, well, obstruction of justice is that act that someone commits when they're engaged in having committed a crime or trying to hide a crime from letting any accountability come to that individual. And in this case, this president was engaged in a massive cover-up, has been, around what happened in the 2016 election cycle. But even if one doesn't accept that he was involved there, the obstruction itself is a crime, regardless of whether there was an underlying offense that occurred. And the reason why it's so serious is that the judicial system is set up in a way that makes sure that we should not allow those who are engaged in trying to cover up their wrongdoing to get away with it. And if you obstruct justice, if you prevent the law enforcement from carrying out that accountability measure through the process, then that itself is a crime separate and apart from the underlying crimes that are being investigated. This president repeatedly tried to have Robert Mueller fired. He fired James Comey, the former FBI director, which set us on the course with respect to the Mueller investigation. He has sought to denigrate and undermine that investigation. And frankly, then the last obstruction of justice that he really committed, which wasn't in the Mueller report, was that he put Bill Barr in there as Attorney General to shut it down and to shut down that Southern District of New York investigation and hush money payments.
He's ordered his staff or former staff not to testify under oath when they are required to by subpoena. He has refused across the board, not here and there, from respecting subpoenas from law enforcement officials and from Congress for materials from the executive branch. There is no such thing, as executive privilege vis-a-vis congressional investigations, especially under an impeachment inquiry. The Supreme Court has never ruled that the president has executive privilege in this area. So he's blocking the sheriff. He's blocking the grand juries. He's blocking the state enforcement officials who are trying to get his tax returns. It's one thing to contest these things in court under full due process, but it's quite another thing to use the force of the presidency to bully people to commit crimes themselves, in effect, to obstruct justice themselves and not testify under oath about what they know in the process of a official investigation. Here's what I think the worst impeachable offense is. It's almost never mentioned. The President of the United States must faithfully execute the laws. He has been putting in office officials at the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, the Auto Safety Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the FAA, on and on, people who do not believe in regulation, people whose only qualification in some of these agencies, like Scott Pruitt, nominated to head the Environmental Protection Administration, who thinks the agency should be dissolved, and others in charge of the public lands think that public land should be sold off to private owners and businesses. And so the result is that the health and safety and economic well-being laws of our federal government are being paralyzed, if not destroyed, day after day, lawsuits underway being pulled back, regulations being revoked, and in the process, more people are dying, more children are getting asthma, more people are being stolen from by the commercial corporatists. He's, in effect, shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was designed to bring Wall Street to accountability and to deal with the financial ripoffs of banks and credit card companies over millions of people, like the Wells Fargo criminal racket. And he's virtually shut that one down. Now, this in its totality, John, is a massive impeachable offense.
Yes,
Wouldn't you say?
It absolutely is. And I would add to that the fact that he's incited violence, giving aid and comfort to white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and undermining constitutional protections of equal protection under the law, which would also fall under that rubric of taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. This president has engaged in such abusive behavior since taking the oath of office that it's incredible, really, that we're just now starting a formal impeachment investigation in the U.S. Congress. It should have happened a lot earlier, and we've been pressing for this from the moment he took that oath because of the emoluments violations. But there's now 12 that we have identified on our site at impeachmentproject.org, and they include many that you just cite.
Yes, impeachmentproject.org. Let me elaborate for people who are still not convinced on the destruction of the rule of law by Trump in the health, safety, and economic area. We've heard him many times say he wants clean, beautiful coal to proliferate and burn more of. He's also said our air and water has never been cleaner. He's also repealed standards holding down coal burning pollution and coal ash emissions. So basically, and we'll get to his chronic lying, which is classically fulfilling the dread of Alexander Hamilton, who called an impeachable offense an abuse of the public trust, is basically he is pursuing all the things he says he's doing the opposite of. He's good for workers. Well, manufacturing is way down now. And he said factories are coming from foreign countries back to the U.S. Nonsense. It's false. Manufacturing is declining. He says that the drinking water is going to be cleaner than ever, and he is allowing worse emissions into the water supplies of our country by turning back water pollution prevention or containment standards. And here's one I just learned about by listening to public radio. He has shut down the silicosis unit in the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. Shut it down, not just weakened it, not just pushed out scientists the way he did at EPA and elsewhere, not just bullied civil servants who take an oath to enforce the law as passed by Congress and signed by prior presidents. Well, now there are 100,000 workers who are working in the area of manufacturing of tabletop counters for kitchens, etc. Companies have developed this new engineering of composite materials that increases by almost tenfold the silica dust that's breathed by these workers. And now they're coming down with fatal silicosis disease. And he shuts down the unit that was designed to save the workers' lives. So these are clearly impeachable offenses, Trump voters. Wake up to the realities. How do you focus on lying? Do you think chronic lying by the day, by the hour, over 12,000 documented lies and misleading statements about reality by the Washington Post, how would you weave that if you were in the House of Representatives into an impeachable offense?
I think the way we would weave it is to demonstrate that there's a pattern here of abuse of power and abuse of the public trust, and that it certainly comes into that realm of high crimes when a president so defrauds, really, the process of engaging in governing to the point where up is down, true is false, and everything goes to his personal gain. And that's how we would define it. But you know, the other impeachable offense we haven't talked about is what he's doing to children and their families at the southern border. This is a president who's engaged in overseeing cruel and unconstitutional imprisonment of children and their families at the southern border. The Supreme Court long ago has established that when you cross the border anywhere in the United States, regardless of whether you have papers to cross, you are entitled to due process protections. You're entitled to be able to apply for asylum. Instead, what he's done is he's locked kids in cages, separated them from their families, 8 kids now having died in subhuman conditions. There's a former Nuremberg prosecutor who's been tracked down by Michael Moore. You may have seen this interview he did with him in which he defined this as a crime against humanity, what's happened to these children and to their families. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky called it state-sponsored kidnapping. I mean, this is the kind of behavior that is certainly a high crime, must be faced in terms of accountability via the impeachment process, and yet it is not right now part of the discussion in Washington. We accept and certainly are glad to see that the Congress is moving forward on the Ukraine scandal and the impeachable offenses arising from that. But we will continue with our allies to demand that they expand the scope of that inquiry to cover all of his impeachable offenses, because the danger here is that we set a precedent going forward that just those kinds of impeachable offenses under the Ukraine scandal is how he'll be held accountable, and all the other impeachable offenses he gets away with without any accountability. That's too dangerous of a precedent to set in our view.
Well, on the border situation, he's basically refused to enforce the Asylum Act, and so he shoved that back to Honduras, where they came from, which is one of the highest homicide rates in the world with all the criminal gangs and drug cartels and all. And he was reported reliably in the New York Times. I think they had some of the White House aides tell him that in a meeting with the White House recently, White House aides, Trump pounded on the table and said, shut the border, close the border entirely. And the aides said, Mr. President, this will strand tourists, American tourists. It will strand kids that go to school back and forth across the border. It will block $200 billion of aid and send the stock market into a tailspin and drive the corporations up the wall because they can't get their goods in order to assemble them and sell them in the United States. And he flushed red. He looked at him and said, I'll give you a week to take care of this problem. Otherwise, quote, I have the absolute power to shut down the border, end quote. No president has the absolute power to do anything. The word absolute means there are no constitutional restraints at all. They have discretion, but they don't have absolute power. And he goes around, shouting, I could kill 10 million people in Afghanistan, but I don't want to. Even though I could end the war in a week, and I could do this and I could do it. It's as if Congress doesn't exist, which gets us to the really ipso facto constitutional violation, which is he is blocking the exercise of Congress's constitutional authority. He's defying subpoenas. He's defying requests for testimony by his aides, and he's defying the impeachment inquiry. Would you say that defiance itself, never mind anything else he does, that defiance itself over a period of time is a grave constitutional issue?
Absolutely. It's created a constitutional crisis. It was the reason why the House Judiciary Committee passed in 1974 the third article of impeachment against then President Richard Nixon. And that was an article focused on then President Nixon's obstruction of Congress. And that's what this is. This is direct obstruction of Congress and its oversight responsibilities, particularly in an impeachment inquiry. And it is one of the gravest of crimes, high crimes. And, this is also why Congress should not prolong this process much further. As much as they have court fights that are pending, trying to get Don McGahn to testify, trying to get the grand jury materials from the Mueller investigation, the reality of it is right now is that we are in this urgent moment where Donald Trump, almost on a daily basis, attacks our Constitution, our democracy, and the rule of law. He's a direct and serious threat to our republic, and he needs to face impeachment proceedings now. So we have issued with other allies, Credo Action, By the People, and others, a deadline of November 1st for the House Judiciary Committee to issue articles of impeachment out of that committee, and November 15th for the full House to vote on those articles and send them to the Senate for a trial. We don't need many more weeks of this. We do need to tell the American people all the evidence. The Congress needs to show all that in summary proceedings. But the continued obstruction of Congress that this president is committing demonstrates why we need to move forward swiftly with this process.
Well, Elizabeth Drew, writing in the New York Times the other day, said the House of Representatives under Nancy Pelosi would be making a mistake just going forward with one article of impeachment, that is the whole Ukraine travesty, and that they should go with all the major articles of impeachment if they're going to inform the public, get the backing of the public, start fracturing the Republican base for Trump which is already showing signs of doing so in Congress, and making the full case. Because if you just go forward with one, and it can be bulldozed and distorted and whatever, you don't have another chance to come back.
Right.
What's your view
agree.
on that, John?
I agree fully with what Elizabeth Drew has written. I do agree that it is both politically and constitutionally unwise for Congress solely to focus on the Ukraine scandal. And look, the reality here is that what's happened and transpired over the past couple of weeks with this scandal is what has been building for many, many months. People want to say, well, this was Speaker Pelosi finally moving forward and looking at a scandal that she says is simple for the American people to understand. No, what really happened here is that for many, many months, there's been sustained pressure on members of Congress by a people's movement demanding impeachment proceedings. You know, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman has said repeatedly, and she sat on the House Judiciary Committee, as you know, in 1974 during the Watergate era. She said they didn't start that impeachment inquiry against then President Nixon because of a special prosecutor's report or because grand jury materials came forward and were made available to House Judiciary Committee. No, they started in October 1973, that impeachment inquiry, because the people demanded it. And here, the people have been demanding this impeachment process begin. And the Ukraine scandal was the final straw to all this. And that sustained pressure finally moved Pelosi and others who were on the fence to get on the right side of history. But they need to feel the continued pressure to not solely rely on that scandal and those high crimes, but to demonstrate to the American people all the high crimes that this president has committed, starting with the moment he took the oath of office, treating the Oval Office as a profit-making enterprise at the public expense.
And it's hardly a secret. I mean, for example, repeatedly he has said that he could launch military strikes anywhere in the world that he wants. No, he can't. Only Congress has the authority to declare war. Impeachment offense number 1. He's involved in 9 wars right now around the world. Sure, he inherited some from impeachable offenses of prior presidents who got away with it, but he's already now in Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Al-Qaeda and ISIS areas. And where's the congressional authority for that? I mean, it's true, Congress has been a coward. They've abdicated their congressional duties. But he keeps basically saying, I can, inflict armed force on anyone. And then the second thing he thinks he can do is spend money any way he wants, even against the dictates of congressionally appropriated programs. That's another impeachable offense. He was once heard saying that the Constitution lets me do whatever I want as president. I can do whatever I want as president. That's a widely quoted refrain from him. So when you combine all this obliviousness, he doesn't read. I'm almost certain he hasn't read the Constitution. He doesn't like to read. He looks at TV a good part of the day. He doesn't preside over the executive branch. He just puts people there to do the bidding of big corporations and Wall Street. He's been used to being ahead of the sheriff. He's been ahead of the law, violating the law, catching up with him as a business executive. He hired hundreds of undocumented Polish workers in hazardous conditions, building one of his buildings, for example, and then had to be sued by their lawyers because he wouldn't pay them their full pay. I mean, this is a deranged individual. And the consequence of this is summed up in his chronic day after day lying. Now, lying means, John, to me, it means government secrecy and cover-up. That's one thing lying provides. Lying tells the American people that things are happening that are totally not happening, like manufacturing is going up. Lying means that we can't defend our country using the federal government against climate disruption, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, in plain sight. Scientists warning every week about it's getting worse. It's worse than our own predictions. And he calls it a China hoax. He calls it a hoax, climate disruption, a hoax from China to make money off the United States. So we're dealing here, if you had a neighbor who wildly slandered and inaccurately slandered people who couldn't defend themselves, who wildly lied about everything that he didn't do, did do, should do, would do, a person who lied about the whole reality in the community and had power over you as a neighbor or as a city council person or as a mayor. What would people think of neighbors or local politicians like that? So he's really a candidate for the 25th Amendment. Explain that.
Well, the 25th Amendment does provide for removal of a president based on incapacity to carry out the duties of the office. And there are clear issues here with this president and his mental capacity to carry out that duty. The challenge with the 25th Amendment is that it needs to be invoked by cabinet members. Now, Congressman Raskin has a bill in the Congress to deal with setting up a commission that would allow for Congress to also invoke the 25th Amendment. But for now, it seems very unlikely that his cabinet members, who are lapdogs, will invoke the 25th Amendment. But I want to come back to another point you've rightly made, Ralph, which is about his view of absolute authority here. Timothy Egan of the New York Times, a columnist, wrote a very important column the other day in which he reminded everyone of how Nixon had this famous statement, if the president does it, it is not illegal. You know, and what he paints in that column is that is Donald Trump's motto times 100, because it's not just if the president does it, it is not illegal. It's really if Donald Trump does it, it is not illegal. His whole life has been about disregard for the law, disregard for rules, and he's gotten away repeatedly with many other violations even before becoming president. So he really, I think, does believe that he can get away with it. He has that Fifth Avenue line of shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue and getting away with it. I think he really believes that. And the sad reality is, until now, just until now, I think he saw that he was getting away with it. And now all of a sudden, Congress has finally grown some backbone and decided to move forward with this impeachment inquiry. The question will be, will they go beyond the inquiry? Will they actually issue the articles of impeachment? And then what will happen in the Senate? And every member of the Senate, Republican and Democratic alike, must be forced to vote on this question. Do they condone this outrageous, lawless behavior of this president, or will they stand up to it and defend our Constitution at this critical moment in our history?
Well, actually, it's worse than that. In the last few days, he's inciting the prospect of civil war if he is impeached. If he,
yes,
Donald Trump, is impeached, which there will be a civil war, which is a way of giving signals to people who might take him seriously. You know, the adjectives he uses to describe people, he calls people sick, treasonous, low IQ, disgraceful, crooked. They all can just be turned around in describing him. At what point does his words become incitation to riot? Isn't that a crime?
There's no question he should be charged via an article of impeachment for inciting violence. We know that the El Paso shooter who engaged in that horrific mass shooting in El Paso cited his language of an invasion happening of immigrants coming across the southern border for why he went and committed that horrific act. We know that this president has called out 4 members of Congress, known as the Squad, all of whom are American citizens, 3 of whom have been born here, and he said they should go back to where they came from, which raised physical threats and violence against them to a higher level. This is a president who's very dangerous in the oath of office, and precisely why he needs to face impeachment proceedings. Too many people up until now have been saying, well, we'll impeach him at the ballot. There is no such thing as impeachment at the ballot. We hold elections every 4 years to deal with who will be president. We hold impeachment processes to deal with direct threats to our republic, and that's what this president is.
Well, the danger, of course, is as he goes around the country for his campaign in front of huge rallies where a lot of people come for the entertainment, and they don't just swear by him. And he points to reporters, or he points to people who are standing peacefully with a sign objecting to his policies. And he incites the others who are hollering in his favor to violence, and they inflict it on these people. Can he be prosecuted?
I believe he can and should be, yes. And I also will add that I don't believe that Robert Mueller or anyone else who's in a prosecutorial authority position should be ignoring the responsibility to hold this person accountable in the court of law. The policy of the Justice Department is not binding on prosecutors. It should not be seen as binding. In fact, there's no requirement whatsoever in the Constitution that somehow you can't indict a sitting president. And I think part of what we're dealing here with is a president who knows that he, at this point, has faced immunity for the crimes he's committed in terms of a court of law, and that if he wins re-election or somehow is declared the winner, that he very well may run out the statute of limitations on some of those criminal statutes. So he has a real incentive to do whatever he can to rig the process, to seek foreign assistance in our elections, to do anything else to ensure that he somehow stays in that Oval Office. And this is, again, why impeachment is so critical as a remedy to address this crisis now.
John, this notion that you can't indict a sitting president is just an opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department. That doesn't have the force of law. Why did Mueller acknowledge it? Why do even Democrats refer to it? It's total nonsense because it is not an opinion from the Supreme Court. It is just an opinion from a bunch of lawyers who are hired to support the president.
Absolutely.
When did that occur?
Well, it occurred back during the Watergate era, actually, and it was a policy that was initially drawn up around the investigations of Agnew and Vice President Agnew at the time. And there was a concern somehow that if Agnew got indicted as he was facing tax evasion charges, that then the president might face indictment for other crimes he's committed. So they drew up this policy. They drew out an exception that made no sense from a constitutional perspective. But you're absolutely right. It has no basis in the Constitution. And I believe when the history is written on the Mueller investigation, we will learn that there was most likely a fierce fight within that team as to whether to issue an indictment. We already know out of the Southern District of New York that Donald Trump was named individual one for directing a federal criminal conspiracy. And then lo and behold, William Barr becomes Attorney General and that investigation ends. Michael Cohen goes to jail, but that's it. So we know there were prosecutors in that office who thought there should be further proceedings. Mm-hmm. And I think there most likely were prosecutors in the Mueller investigation who thought that as well.
Just to complete the point here, the Supreme Court has never adopted the principle that a sitting president cannot be indicted.
Not only that, but in Nixon v. U.S., the Supreme Court made clear that the president had to turn over the tapes and that he was not immune. He didn't have that absolute power that Nixon tried to claim. So I'm fully in agreement with you that not only is there no Supreme Court precedent, but that policy should not be cited with any authoritative basis by anyone, in power in the government, and they should proceed to hold this president accountable.
You certainly can't refer to the Office of Legal Counsel's opinion acceptably and still say the president is not above the law.
Absolutely.
Because that allows him to be above the law. He can't be indicted no matter what he does. Anyway, here are some quick reasons for opposing impeachment that we've seen floated around. Well, if the House impeaches Trump, the Senate will acquit in a trial. So why bother?
I think the reason why we need to proceed is that the articles need to be issued, the charges need to be issued, this president needs to face accountability in the House. If the Senate votes to acquit, the trial itself will be a critical educational opportunity for the American people, and the president will have been yet the third president in American history to be impeached. It will be a stain on his presidency forever, for history to mark, and we will have, once again, an important accountability moment. Obviously, we're going to fight to ensure that senators vote the right way, that there's a removal that happens, but even if we don't prevail in the Senate on this, the process of issuing those articles of impeachment is critical for setting precedents for future administrations and ensuring that this president be held accountable.
Also, we're talking with John Bonifaz, lawyer and leader of the impeachment drive in the civic community in our country, a longtime public interest advocate. There's another reason. The impeachment clause in the Constitution is not based on a political calculation. It's based on a constitutional duty. It's like a fearless prosecutor prosecuting someone who is very popular in the community, but the prosecutor does his or her duty. And also, don't discount, skeptics, the effect of 10 or 20 nationally televised hearings in changing public opinion even more than it's changing as we speak. It's already shifting more against Trump on the impeachment inquiry. It's now into majority territory. Here's another argument against impeachment. The American people don't care about the impeachment. They care about health care. They care about a clean environment. They care about jobs. They care about public facilities being repaired. Why is the House of Representatives under the Democrats distracting away from those things that the House should be focused on? Your reply.
Well, first is the answer you just gave on the constitutional requirements of members of Congress. When faced with this kind of constitutional crisis, they have a duty to engage in impeachment proceedings and issue articles of impeachment. Second, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can proceed with impeachment proceedings and have Congress also engage in all their other responsibilities to improve the lives of American people, to help and support economic justice, to protect the environment, and so forth. It's not like we can't do both, but it is true that we're facing a constitutional crisis today, and Congress has a responsibility to protect and defend the Constitution. Each member of Congress took an oath of office, just like the president, to protect and defend and preserve the Constitution, and that's what this is about. The other point I would make is that people said, well, the polling showed that the majority of the public did not support impeachment. And, there were polls that were in the 30s and 40s showing support for impeachment, which is quite high given that an impeachment inquiry had not begun. But the polling numbers were higher than where they were at the start of the impeachment inquiry with Richard Nixon. Now, just in a week's time, we see polling that shows majority support for this impeachment inquiry, 55% under the CBS News poll that just came out supporting this impeachment inquiry. So it's actually not true that the American people don't support this. They do. They recognize that no one is above the law, not even the President of the United States, and this president needs to be held accountable. But I also think this is one of those moments where the principle and the politics are aligned. Yes, we have to put principle over politics. But the fact of the matter is the American people want to see bold leadership. They want to see people who will stand up for the rule of law and stand up for accountability against entrenched power that violates the Constitution. And that's what we're seeing already in the polling as a result of the announcement that they're moving forward. And we're going to see that continue to rise, and people recognize that this man needs to be held accountable.
We're out of time. We've been talking with John Bonifaz, who is a civic leader, lawyer, and a leading advocate for the Congress to impeach and convict President Donald J. Trump on a whole series of grave and repeated violations of our Constitution and criminal statutes. Thank you very much, John. Can you once more give our listeners the website?
Yes, people can learn more about this impeachment campaign at impeachmentproject.org, and they can learn more about our work to defend our democracy and our Constitution at freespeechforpeople.org. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with all of you about this critical question facing our nation today. Thank you.
We have been speaking with John Bonifaz. We will link to the Impeachment Project at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Right now, we're going to take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. When we come back, we'll welcome back the Green Cowboy, David Freeman, who's going to give us his take on the recent worldwide climate strike march. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute. For Friday, October 4, 2019, I'm Russell Mokhiber. Corporations keep breaking the law, and the Justice Department keeps refusing to prosecute them. The Department of Justice's chronic refusal to bring criminal prosecutions against big banks, big pharma, and other big businesses that violate the law has led to a failure to deter repeat offenders. That's according to a report from Public Citizen. Instead of prosecuting corporations, the department, starting in the early 2000s, has increasingly relied on agreements that prosecutors and corporate defense attorneys negotiate behind closed doors to keep corporations, usually the largest, out of the criminal justice system. Under President Trump, corporate prosecutions have plummeted to the lowest level in more than 20 years. Corporate leniency agreements, deferred non-prosecution agreements, however, are on the rise again. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. I was at a gala for Public Citizen in June, and there were two people in the crowd who were quite easy to spot. That's because they were both wearing cowboy hats. One was Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, and the other was our next guest.
David Freeman is an engineer, an attorney, and an author who has been called an eco-pioneer for his environmentally conscious leadership of both the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. He is also a noted anti-nuclear activist and the author of a number of books on energy policy, including Winning Our Energy Independence and his latest, All Electric America. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, David Freeman.
Yeah, I'm delighted to still be around and to be back.
Well, David, you're 93 years of a bundle of dynamic energy. And when I saw all those young people around the world hitting the streets, skipping school sometimes, having good signs on climate disruption and action, they're not looking for words, they're not looking for praise and a pat on the head by their elders. They're looking for action. And I foresee that the 4 million that came out a few days ago are going to be 8 million and 20 million and 50 million, which means they've got to have a strategy. They've got to have tactics and a strategy. They got to go to the next step. And the next step is where you come in. The next step is what specifically they should demand and who should they demand it from? Lawmakers, governors, city council people, whatever. How should they direct this kind of energy? Because it's going to become the greatest mass demonstrations in the history of the world, in my opinion. Take it from there, David Freeman.
Well, we need to go, and they know it, we need to go from slogans to proposing laws. And we need to go to everybody. It needs to happen at every level of government. And it can, and with the help of all these kids, it will. I went to one of the rallies at Howard University recently, and I doubled the average age just by being there. But I was impressed that AOC got out there after the old guys spoke, and she just very calmly said, "We're going to try. And we'll fail, and then we'll try again. And then we're going to try again, and we're going to be here until we succeed." And I think that that's their spirit. But it's time to go from slogans to laws. And, the problem with us older people is that we got 170 IQs trying to solve a 110 IQ problem. And the problem is fossil fuels. It's 70% of the greenhouse gases being emitted. And the answer is old-fashioned. We need to outlaw the goddamn stuff. I mean, we need to pass laws at every level, at the city council level, at the state level, at the federal level especially, but all of the above. And, I'm old enough to remember Pearl Harbor. And if you listen to climatologists, we have a threat that is far greater than even the Nazi menace. It threatens to eliminate the only home we've got. And what happened then is we told Detroit to stop making cars altogether and make tanks and airplanes, and we won the war. We had gasoline rationing, and nobody gave a second thought to whether that's the appropriate thing. We haven't yet decided as a nation or as a population on Earth that we've got to do this.
David, you're a very practical person. You're an engineer, a lawyer. You've run 4 giant utilities, Tennessee Valley Authority, 2 giant utilities in California, 1 in 5. There you are. And you've closed more nuclear plants than anybody else put together, starting with Sacramento, replacing it with energy efficiency. So
Yeah.
our listeners are saying, what? You mean he wants to outlaw fossil fuels? You can't do that immediately. What do you do in the car? What do you do for electricity and so forth? So outline exactly your practical plan that you've put before governors and members of Congress.
The first thing we've got to decide is the electric power industry is used to being regulated, and we need to give them a fresh set of orders. All new power plants must be zero emission. It's a very simple law. You have to reduce your emissions of greenhouse gases at least 5% below current levels every year until you get down to zero. And if you don't do it, it's against the law, and I would fine them a huge amount of money and not allow the fine to be passed on to the customer. I mean, how in the hell do you think we got scrubbers put on the coal-fired power plants in the 70s? It took a law. And you, of all people, Ralph, know how you got seatbelts in the cars. It took a law. We have passed laws in the past that require things in the public interest. But first, you got to demand it. And going around just with slogans about environmental justice is the beginning, but that has to be translated into specific laws. And the idea of talking about a carbon tax, that's a sophisticated way of saying that you can pay to pollute. No, this stuff is poison. It's burning up the only home we've got. It's on fire. Listen to the climatologists and act on that basis. So we have to propose laws. And let's start at the cities. Most of the big cities are governed by mayors, most of whom have taken a pledge to 100% renewable. They've taken that pledge because it's easy and it sounds good and everybody applauds them, but they're not doing a damn thing today. And the pollution is still going up. So I say to my grandchildren, and that's what they are, is let's start at the city level. Let's take downtown of every city in this country and say you can't burn gasoline downtown anymore, and then widen the circle every year until you can't burn gasoline in the city limits of most of the cities anymore. I mean, we have to recognize that the climatologists are not saying that it's okay to wait 12 years and then do it. We've got to start now. The assumption is that if we start now and go down to zero steadily, that we might still have a place where some of us can live. And therefore, all the Democratic candidates who are getting by with just making pious pledges, the big debate is 2040 or 2045. Well, who gives a damn if we're doing nothing in or not even demanding that they do something in 2020 or 2021? So what needs to be done is very clear. We need to be proposing laws that say everything new, and the same of cars. Give Detroit 5 years notice. That's reasonable. Say every car you make starting 5 years from now has to be zero emission. Tell all the taxi cabs in this country, you got 5 years. All your cars have to be zero emission, and that's for Lyft and Uber and all of them. And you know what the byproduct will be? We will stop giving kids asthma. There's still a terrible air pollution problem in all the cities in this country. Imagine if you didn't burn fossil fuels in the cities anymore. You have a byproduct immediately of eliminating a major source of lung disease.
You know, David, you make a very important point. The people who argue against climate disruption, they're arguing it on a too high level. They can make the arguments to the climatologists, but they should also say, look, one byproduct of dealing with climate change is less air pollution in the lungs of your kids, like you just said, asthma. Another byproduct is you're going to get more energy per dollar because energy efficient burning, until we get to the whole renewable, is less productive of greenhouse gases. So you save in the pocketbook, you save in your health on the ground, and you're saving the planet up there.
Yeah, you don't have a better deal than that anywhere on Earth. I mean, as I say, we're using much too sophisticated, and everybody that keeps saying we need more research needs to shut the hell up. We don't need more research.
Explain that.
Because the modern day Edisons have learned how to harness the inexhaustible, everlasting, free power of the sun and the wind. And now we have technology that is just like the dams that the old New Deal built. Once you build them, the fuel is free and they're virtually maintenance-proof. And the plain truth of the matter is the green jobs are in building the solar plants and building the windmills. But after they're built, I can tell you what the cheap power in America today is the dams that were built under Roosevelt. I ran the New York Power Authority, and I sold hydropower out of Niagara Falls for 1 cent a kilowatt hour, and I made 90% profit on it. There's 7 people up there that run that power plant. The same will be true of the solar and the wind. And if you drive an electric car, the cost of the electricity is the equivalent of about 75 cents a gallon gas. So we're going to have a cheaper energy economy as well as a cleaner energy economy.
We've been talking to David Freeman, who is an engineer, a lawyer, has run major utilities, advised governments all over the country, and everybody on the other side that opposes his views, I dare you to debate him. Thank you, David Freeman.
Thank you, Ralph. Bye-bye.
We've been speaking with the Green Cowboy, David Freeman. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, John Bonifaz and, of course, David Freeman. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Put your citizen hat on, listeners. Washington, D.C. is going to go through tumultuous times in the next few weeks.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we continue our conversations with both John Bonifaz on impeachment and David Freeman on energy. First, more with John Bonifaz, where along the way, David and Steve join the conversation.
In my opinion, the chronic lying is all that's needed to get a president impeached. Day after day, he's lying to the American people. He's telling them he's doing this, good for them, when he's doing just the opposite, like in occupational disease enforcement, or in food safety, or in pharmaceutical pricing, that he promised to pull down the price of drugs. And then he lies to them about what he's doing. He's like operating in rarefied air. He's never done anything wrong. It's all lies. It's all treason. This lying is something people who are his greatest supporters should take very seriously. For example, there are millions and millions of people who call themselves evangelicals, reborn Christians, and they are very strong Trump supporters. And I had a theologian the other day tell me that he's looked over the 10 Commandments, and Donald Trump violates and has violated 7 of them again and again and again. Why does that have an impact on the evangelical voters? We know that the leading religious leaders, they're being courted by Trump and brought to the White House and flattered. But why are the ordinary, hard-working evangelicals exonerating his violation of basic principles of their religion?
I mean, it's a mystery, right? They're being sold a false bill of goods, but they have to know that this president violates their own core principles every day, and yet somehow they stand by him. And I do think it's incredible the ways they stand by him. Perhaps it's because they believe that he will continue to stack the courts with right-wing judges who will, in their hopes, overturn Roe v. Wade and reproductive rights for women across the country. Perhaps that's their end goal. And so no matter what has to happen, the ends justify the means in their view to get to that point. But, I do think that some of these people within his administration, even Don McGahn and others, have stayed with him for so long because of that aspect of what he's doing to the federal judiciary and the way in which he basically, just lets the federal society to decide who the nominees are. And then he's got Mitch McConnell there shoving them through, often with very little resistance from Senator Schumer. So, this is a whole other piece of this presidency that doesn't get talked about. And we have one sitting Justice, Judge Kavanaugh, who went in under a real cloud of legitimacy, having been accused credibly of sexual assault, having been accused of perjury during his judiciary confirmation hearing in 2004 and 2006 for the D.C. Circuit, and then again this past year. And so there's real questions about the legitimacy of the court as a result of that. And I think as we continue to see people standing by Donald Trump, those who want to see this ends justifying the means, we will see this disintegration of our democratic institutions.
I must say that your point about the Congress can walk and chew gum at the same time needs even greater elaboration, because a lot of the impeachable offenses of Donald Trump affect the kitchen table well-being of tens of millions of Americans. They affect their health, their safety, their health insurance. He wanted to take away the Obamacare provisions that would have taken away directly health insurance for 20 million people. He is affecting their health and safety by destroying health and safety standards and eliminating regulations. He's cutting food stamps, which will take away free lunches for hundreds of thousands of children. I mean, it's not like the impeachable offenses are abstract legal doctrines and they don't have direct impact on the daily livelihood of all the American people. All
Ralph,
the people
you're absolutely
breathe
right.
his contaminated air, for example.
You're absolutely right. And I would add, we issued a report just last week on the president's racist abuses of power and how they rise to impeachable offenses. And if you're a person of color in this country and you have a president who consistently engages in these racist abuses of power, you're impacted by the way in which he undermines equal protection laws, incites violence, infuses racism in his rhetoric and his policy. So, there are direct ways in which these impeachable offenses affect the lives of people all over the nation. And this is exactly why we shouldn't be separating them out somehow and say, well, this is just some kind of procedure that Congress is doing, but the real work of Congress is to take care of the American people. No, the real work of Congress is to do both. And often in this case, it overlaps, that dealing with this lawless president is taking care of the American people and taking care of our country and our Constitution.
And he thinks the American workers are overpaid. He said that during the campaign verbatim, and he fulfilled that observation. He has continued to freeze the $7.25 per hour federal minimum wage, depriving millions of workers from even being paid inflation adjusted what workers were paid back in 1968. Before we tell our listeners how they can get all your very good information and repeat your website, David and Steve, do you have any comments or questions?
If I were a Republican, I would tell Senator McConnell, to pull a Merrick Garland. Don't even bring a vote on impeachment. Does McConnell have the power just to completely ignore the articles of impeachment the way he did Merrick Garland's nomination?
He doesn't under the Constitution. The Senate shall have sole power for removal of the president. And that language shall is very much of a command. And in fact, Senator McConnell admitted that just a couple of days ago, in which he made clear on CNBC in an interview that he would be obligated to hold a trial. And now the question is, A, will he fulfill that commitment, which is required under the Constitution, but B, will he conduct and oversee, the Chief Justice oversees, is the presiding officer, but will Senator McConnell allow for a full and thorough trial, not just, some kangaroo court type trial that happens in 1 hour and then they're done and then they vote. All the evidence needs to be laid out. The House managers have a right to present their evidence. Donald Trump can bring in his cadre of attorneys, or he can show up himself to try to defend himself. But that process, that trial needs to take place for the nation. And Senator McConnell needs to be pressured to ensure that the trial is full and thorough for all.
But if he doesn't, does Justice Roberts have any power?
You know, it's very much of a ceremonial position that the Chief Justice has. However, there's never been a situation where there's been an impeachment set of articles issued by the House and the Senate has ignored it. So I think Justice Roberts would be pushed in that situation to speak out. I mean, his own legacy will then be potentially undermined if he is essentially, seen as a stooge for a kangaroo type court or even a refusal to comply with the Constitution. But I think the other point on this, again, is back to the Elizabeth Holtzman point. This is about the American people and what we demand. And I think we're going to have to be in the streets. We're going to have to be calling our members of Congress. We're going to be writing them. We're going to have to be meeting with them in their districts and the senators as well. And we're going to have to be demanding that the Constitution be followed here and the rule of law be followed, and that this lawless president, be held accountable. We're on a road here, a very dangerous road, that if we don't abide by the Constitution and the rule of law, I think we will be setting a very dangerous precedent for future administrations.
And it'll be very perilous politically for the Republicans for McConnell to move quickly for an acquittal before the full evidence is put before the Senate. Then it becomes a really hazardous re-election campaign for his Republicans. He could lose control of the Senate. Steve?
You think it would be worse politically if McConnell just completely shuts the impeachment process down?
Well, I do. I agree with Ralph on that. I do think that there will be serious vulnerability for those senators running for re-election, including Mitch McConnell himself. I don't think it's at all unrelated that Senator McConnell's decision to come out just a couple of days ago to say he will hold a trial is related to the fact that he's facing election in 2020. So, he himself knows that the voters will be responding to this if he doesn't comply with the Constitution. That being said, what he did with the Merrick Garland nomination is outrageous. He's shown a willingness to shirk his constitutional responsibilities, and it's why we have to keep the pressure on. I don't take him at his word that he's going to hold a trial, and I certainly don't assume it will be a full and thorough trial unless we demand it. So that this gets back to what we, the people, must do in this process. We can't sit by idly, and this is, all about Ralph's entire public interest life and career, right? We don't sit by idly and let those in power make decisions that undermine us, that impact us in negative ways. We stand up and we fight. And I think this is exactly the moment for the American people to rise up and demand that our Constitution be upheld, that members of Congress do their duty on the House side and senators do their duty. They are public servants. They are servants to the American people, and we have the ultimate power, and we must rule over this process.
Steve?
Yeah, could you compare the articles of impeachment you've sort of laid out theoretically here for Trump to the articles of impeachment laid out for Bill Clinton 20-some years ago? How would you compare those?
I mean, it's incredible to consider the level of difference. I mean, what you had in the impeachment articles against Bill Clinton is you had perjury and obstruction of justice in a civil proceeding dealing with a sexual harassment case. And in fact, those are serious charges. I don't want to deny those are serious charges, but the level of seriousness at which this president, Donald Trump, has committed impeachable offenses is far, far larger than what we saw with the Bill Clinton impeachment scenario. And it really does demonstrate why this president must be held accountable, because the idea that we would hold a president accountable, as should have happened with obstruction of justice and perjury in 1998, but not hold this current president accountable for the much more serious impeachable offenses he has committed, and all the ones we've listed and discussed on this show, is really offensive to the basic principle that no one is above the law, not even the President of the United States.
Because it seems strategically that the Democrats are looking back at that and how that played out, especially to the public, And that has sort of put the brakes on them doing so with Donald Trump. And you're saying there's just no comparison between the two.
Well, let's be clear about who's been looking back at that scenario. Mostly it's been Speaker Pelosi and her allies in leadership. I mean, we have seen members of Congress, even before this Ukraine scandal, over 130 members of Congress rise to the occasion and support an impeachment inquiry. But you're right, Speaker Pelosi and others that were backing her kept bringing up the Clinton impeachment scandal as the example here, a historical example of the political dangers associated with this. And that was the wrong historical example to look at. The example they should have been looking at all along is the Nixon impeachment example. That's much more analogous to what we have here. And in fact, I think the Ukraine scandal, as I said, was the final straw to get them to see that the appropriate analogy here is to Watergate. This is far worse than Watergate, as bad as that was. But this is the level at which we are dealing with a president who thinks he's above the law and will continue to engage in more destructive behavior if he's not held accountable. The dangers of not proceeding with impeachment are so clear, given what he's already been engaged in committing. One day after the Mueller testimony, he gets on the phone with President Zelensky and directly solicits foreign interference in elections. Why? Because he saw what happened with the congressional testimony. He saw that Congress wasn't going to act, and so he figured, I can continue to do this into 2020. So we're talking about whether we're going to have a free and fair election. How can we possibly allow this person in the Oval Office to be part of standing for re-election when he's so willingly ready to rig the process, attack our democracy and our Constitution, and violate federal laws? And that's why he has to have this moment of accountability and why we need to move forward.
And now, more with David Freeman on the climate strike and nuclear energy.
Okay, let's get down to the gritty here. Who's standing in the way? Is it GM, ExxonMobil? And how do you jolt the lawmakers? Two questions. Who's standing in the way of all this clean, renewable technology and all the benefits to health, safety, mobility, protecting nature? And how do you jolt the lawmakers or replace them?
I think you have to replace them. I am very much in favor of the Sunshine Movement and that crowd that is getting really, truly liberal people to run against the conservative Democrats. What we need to face up to is that even we had a Democratic Senate, we couldn't get really good laws passed because too many of them were sold out to the oil and gas people. We've got to get people in Oklahoma, Texas, the oil states that always go the wrong way to get in office and join the rest of us in outlawing fossil fuels. Now, what's in the way is most of the money in the world. I mean, Saudi Arabia is never going to be in favor of what I'm talking about, nor are the companies that own all that oil and gas in the ground. We got to put them out of business, and they're going to fight back. But that's why I do agree it's going to take the equivalent of political revolution. But these kids get it. They see through all this. And what we need to do, I think, is to get them to move and work together with them to supply specific laws. And frankly, while I think we need to have laws that the Democratic Party adopts for 2021, we can't assume that they're going to get those enacted immediately. We've got to, right now, the cities of this country are in the hands primarily of Democratic mayors who are mouthing good words about 100% renewable. Well, we've got to be lobbying the laws at the city council and state level all over the country to make that happen.
David, the thing about young people is they can get discouraged easily if they don't see anything happening. They get burned out. You know, we've all seen that over the years. Let me put before you certain step-up pressures. Would you favor the following? 50,000 young people with a permit peacefully demonstrating in front of the White House with signs showing pictures of members of Congress who say climate disruption is a hoax, like Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma or Mitch McConnell, who's the big obstructionist and the leader of the Senate. And then in a loud chorus shouting out to the White House, to President Trump, save the country, lock them up. Save the planet, lock them up.
Well,
would you put your
Ralph,
imprimatur on that?
You've all, yeah, of course, but I'll go you one better. I think some of us are a bit too Washington oriented. I'm for that, but I would be more in favor of 10,000 people in Oklahoma, in Texas. It's in the home of these people, in their district, in their hometowns of marching. I think that we've got to get the young people in the dark red states to speak up and show up and lobby right there in their home territory, in addition to what we do in the nation's capital.
And focus on the lawmakers. Have pictures of them,
right.
Posters.
Yes, I would take your idea and double it locally. I think if we could get people all over the country marching in on the district headquarters and really, if they have a town meeting, flooding the place. I mean, absolutely flooding the place. That's where I think the 1-2 punch. Hit them at home, hit them in D.C., and then hit them on the way in between.
It's even worse. It's even worse than you've been describing. We have a president who not only thinks global climate disruption is a Chinese hoax, but he's destroying the laws that keep global gases down in the United States. He's actually increasing the global warming gases and doing it openly and defiantly, as well as increasing the level of asthma and other diseases from increased air pollution. And a lot of his allies in Congress are doing the same thing. In other words, first, they're not trying to reduce the greenhouse gases. Second, they don't just do nothing. They're actually doing the opposite. They're making it worse.
I agree completely. But in addition to that, I look back at the Obama administration where they were intelligent deniers and didn't do what was needed to be done. And I hold the Democratic Party in some ways almost as responsible, because people that claim they believe as climatologists and then do nothing that Mother Nature notices now. It doesn't take a lot of courage to go to Paris and agree to a non-binding treaty to get clean in 2040. I want the Democratic Party and these candidates that are running for president that are talking so piously to propose laws that have a bite to them right now and turn the curve from going up, up, up to start going down, down, down. And that takes real courage. In other words, tell Detroit that not 2040, but 5 years from now, you can't make anything but zero emission cars. Tell the home builders that the new homes have to be zero emission. Do something that takes some political guts. That's what the kids are demanding. And I don't hear that yet. I mean, out of the Democrats. So, it's absolutely essential that we throw out a dictator. I mean, that's what he is.
David Freeman, who's run 4 major utilities. He's been a consultant to presidents, to governors. Some people in the audience may start saying, well, what about nuclear power? That doesn't produce gas house emissions. Why did you, David Freeman, close down 5 nuclear plants? And you're working now with Pacific Gas and Electric to close down the last nuke plant in California. Why?
And they've agreed to do it because nuclear power plants are the path to the nuclear bomb. The plants themselves are inherently so dangerous. People don't know this. The federal government gives the insurance. If you repeal the law where the federal government guarantees to pick up the tab in case of an accident, nobody would build one. These things are inherently as dangerous as an atomic bomb. They leave nuclear waste that are piled up. The nuclear trash is piling up and nobody knows what to do. It's a forever problem. And in addition to everything else, we've invented solar and wind power that is inherently cheaper. I mean, you've got to be an idiot to be for nuclear power in the age where we have solar and wind power, and either an idiot or sold out.
Solar and wind power comes online much quicker. It takes 15 or 20 years, if that. And the Georgia new nuclear plants have already burdened the taxpayer for $28 billion of loan guarantees, and they still haven't finished them. And they've been at it for over 12 years. And when they come, if they ever finish it, it's going to be multiple times more expensive for the ratepayer, the consumer, than if they had built quicker wind farms and solar panels and solar photovoltaics and solar architecture.
In the competitive parts of the electric power industry where there's competition, no utility has ordered a nuclear power plant for years. It's unthinkable. In the power market of today, when you have zero cost solar and wind, most of the time, the nuclear power has a market value of zero. And frankly, that's why PG&E has agreed with us to shut their plant down. It used to be that you could argue that nuclear power doesn't emit carbon as much as, but we now have an alternative that's even cheaper. So you don't have to be an environmentalist to be opposed to nuclear power. It's dead on the basis of economics, and on top of that, it is radioactive. It leaves us with the danger of Chernobyls and Fukushimas and 3 Mile Island. You got to be out of your mind to be proposing it.
David, apparently one of those people's out of their mind, if you watch the last Democratic debate, was Cory Booker, who was touting, I don't know who's talking to him, but he was touting this party line about all this new technology and all of this safe nuclear power and how that's got to be part of the mix. What do you say to Cory Booker?
I communicated to him directly, and I told him that he was nuts.
You actually spoke to him?
I spoke to him rather directly. Not personally, but I don't want to mention the person's name.
Right.
With the intermediary, but I don't know whether he did it out of ignorance or malice or a combination of the two. But the interesting thing is that new nuclear power plants are dead. Nobody except this Georgia Power Company, no one in the country is even thinking about it. So I don't waste my time debating these people anymore. They lost.
Yeah, you're right. The last nuclear plant that was ordered and put into production was in the 1970s, and Wall Street won't finance a nuclear plant unless they get 100% U.S. government taxpayer guarantee.
Yeah, the one thing the media makes a mistake, they assume that if a person is an expert in one field, that they know about something else. I mean, there are certain climatologists, I won't mention their name, that favor nuclear power. Well, they know about the climate. They don't know doodly squat about energy, and yet the press, gives them a lot of publicity. But fortunately, we've pretty well deregulated the electric power industry, starting in California. And in a competitive marketplace, nuclear is dead. I mean, the existing plants are being shut down, not by me anymore, although we did play a role with PG&E, but Indian Point's being shut down. They're all dying one at a time because they can't compete. They can't compete with solar and wind, even though they've already been built. So it's an idle debate. At any event, I think we pretty well demolished nuclear power for now.
It keeps coming back because it's a type of corporate socialism. The hypocrite Republicans in Congress keep wanting the government to guarantee and bail out existing nuclear plants and guarantee new ones. You should go down and see Senator Booker and others face to face, David Freeman, because they just can't continue. I think a lot of it is ignorance plus campaign contributions. Any comments from David and Steve on this?
Well, I just want to jump in, continuing with this part of the discussion, because I guarantee you we are going to get comments on our webpage after this discussion about how come you never discuss, I'm looking at something here, molten salt reactors. Amazing, Ralph, just amazing. You do the nuclear advocates a massive service by ignoring this topic.
When you back up an advocate for nuclear power plants with all these arguments, the economic one, the national security one, the government guaranteed taxpayer burden one, the earthquake one, etc., they always come back. But don't you know there are now models underway of new nuclear plants that are more efficient and easier to build? Go ahead, David.
Well, I can remember talking to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory about molten salt reactors 40 years ago. I've seen this picture show for a long, long time. My reaction is, if they're all so damn great, go out and build them. Nobody wants to pay for them. I want to devote my time to solving a real problem, which is the climate problem. We've got a real solution, solar and wind. And I just think the nuclear guys can keep yakking till the cows come home, but the plants are being shut down, and every nuclear plant can be replaced with solar and wind in a couple of years. That needs to happen, but we got a big job on our hands to outlaw fossil fuels, and I think we need to focus on that.
David, one other thing, how can people get more information about what you've written on this so they can follow up and connect with their member of Congress?
Well, I think if people want to get all electric America, Bernie Sanders quotes from it. Others do. I think it's pretty close to a Bible on this subject. You can get it at Amazon.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way